Okay, welcome to Seminar 2 of the League of Nations, and today we'll be looking at USA and the League. We'll be looking at the question, why was there lack of support from the Americans for the League? Now remember, just to do a quick recap about the League of Nations, in our last episode, we looked at the origins and the organization type. How did Americans see the League of Nations? I would like to add one thing at this juncture. We have the League of Nations that came out of Woodrow Wilson's 14 point. Now, Woodrow Wilson was the American president who was thinking about what caused the First World War, and he came up with this 14 points. Now, out of those 14 points, the 14th point, that is the last point, number 14, spoke about an organization, an international organization that got together to resolve any disputes, conflict, and maintain peace. Basically, the whole idea of this international organization was to ensure that the world was a peaceful place, maintain peace. Now, the question now is, why was there lack of support from the Americans? Now we're going to look at our first key point. There are three key points altogether. We're going to be looking at our first key point, opposition to the Treaty of Versailles. Now we know that the Treaty of Versailles was a treaty that was signed by the Germans. Now it was a diktat. Basically the Germans had no choice but to sign it at the Hall of Mirrors. During the Paris Peace Conference, they were invited, the German delegates were invited in, and they had to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They had no room to negotiate. They could, however, under that draft, when they were given the Treaty of Versailles draft, they could, however, appeal or negotiate in a way through writing, not verbally, but through writing. Now, let's come back to this. Why was there a lack of support by the Americans? Now, there was an opposition towards the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations was linked to this Treaty of Versailles, along with all the other Versailles settlements, like the Treaty of Neuilly, Sèvres, Trianon, Saint-Germain. All of these, what we call collectively as the Versailles settlement, had this clause which spoke about the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations aim was to uphold the Treaty of Versailles, as well as all the other Versailles settlements, I would add that. Now, since the League of Nations was linked to the Treaty of Versailles, there were many Germans. Now, these were immigrants, German immigrants in America, who took this view about the Treaty of Versailles. They felt that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair. So these German immigrants in the United States viewed the Treaty of Versailles as unfair. By being part of this League of Nations, it means that America would be committed towards enforcing this Treaty of Versailles. So should America sign, that's the second point there, should America sign the Treaty of Versailles, USA would have to enforce the treaty. They wouldn't have a choice. Now, the German immigrants were not so much in favor, as I mentioned earlier. They were not in favor of the Treaty of Versailles, reason being it was unfair. Hence, the German immigrants did not want America to enforce these treaties, okay? The Treaty of Versailles. Now, having said that, let's go to our second key point, which is the horrors of war. Now, under horrors of war, let's look at the term horror. What does the word horror mean? What would be a good synonym for horror? Think about it. Horror. Atrocious, bad. It spells very much negativity. There's a lot of negativity in the word horror. In other words, it's very appalling. So the war had a lot of negative feel to it. What happened during the war, in the First World War, that they should have a negative feel to it? The American soldiers who went to war 100,000 of them had died in the First World War, a war that was fought on European soil. American lives were lost, 100,000 of them. How would the American voters or the American people feel about this? Would they be happy? I doubt so. So many Americans were appalled at the carnage of the First World War and did not want to see a repeat of such a great loss. Hence, by joining the League of Nations, what was the aims of the League of Nations? Basically, when you uphold the treaties, there would be nations who would not be very happy with these treaties. Germany wouldn't be happy, and so they would cause some kind of conflict. And in these conflict, there would probably be exchange of fire, basically. And so life might get sacrificed in this sense. So to many Americans, joining the League of Nations would mean having the United States send its troops to every little conflict around the world. Now remember, when you're resolving disputes, that's based on conflict. When two people disagree with each other, you have a conflict. So if you're going to send American troops over, there are three problems here when you send American troops over. First of all, the cost of sending the troops over. That's the first problem. Second problem is the risk of losing life. In the course of the conflict, lives might be lost, basically. And whose lives are we talking about? American lives, these American troops. And thirdly would be basically opening up themselves to being vulnerable to international conflict. And so they would have to play a very big role, because remember, right after the war, America was the #1 producer, manufacturers in the world. So what can you tell about the GDP of America? Pretty high. So after the war, should America join the League of Nations, they would be committed to resolving the conflicts around the world. And later we'll be talking much about the powers of the League, but just to do a quick sharing with you right over here, what are the powers of the League? Moral contamination. If that doesn't work, then you have economic sanctions. If that doesn't work, then you're going to use action, military action against the perpetrator, the aggressor. How would America fare with this? If they're going to condemn aggressive nations, what if they are trading with these aggressive nations? It'll affect their GDP, their export to these aggressive nations. So in a way, America decided to become very isolated and focus more on their own economy. So to do a quick recap on the horrors of war, three things you just have to bear in mind. Loss of life, okay? They did not want to repeat such a great loss because too many American lives were lost. For them, 100,000 is a lot compared to millions from the French and the British side. And to many Americans, joining the League would mean sending their troops to every little conflict around the world. And who's going to pay for these American troops? Who's going to pay for resolving all these little conflicts around the world? It will be the American taxpayers. So the American people did not support Woodrow Wilson's idea of joining the League. Okay, so with that, we go to our final point, which is economic costs. Just give me a second here. Yes, economic costs. Oops, gone a bit further there. A bit of a technical issue, but it can be resolved. Okay, economic costs. Okay, sorry about that. Sometimes that happens, a little technical error. But let's talk about economic costs right here. Why was there lack of support from the Americans for the League? The third point you can bring up would be economic costs. I did touch a bit about this, but let's continue with this. examples and explanations about economic costs. To many Americans, it seemed as though the United States would be signing a blank check. Like I mentioned earlier, if they were to send their army over, their troops over to anywhere in the world, it's going to burden the American taxpayers. Okay, and how much would it cost? We wouldn't know. That's why it's a blank check. How much would it cost to resolve a conflict, for example, in Ireland Island or Corfu, for that matter, between Italy and Greece? Okay, let's say Italy and Greece, they're having a conflict. Okay, and America have to come in, okay, and resolve this conflict. How much would it cost to do this? So it's like signing a blank check because nobody knew how much it would cost to resolve political dispute. They were unwilling to see United States to solve all international problems, regardless the cost, at the expense of American taxpayers. That's what I was talking about. So yeah, economic cost is another point that you can bring in as to why there was lack of support from Americans for the league, basically. And that wraps up this session. Thank you very much. And I'll see you in our next session. Take care.